Hello, my name is Benjamin Hart. I'm an American attorney and the managing director of Integrity Legal here in Bangkok, Thailand. This video is one that I'm betting will I don't know if people are gonna, if I'm gonna get a huge view count on this video or if it's just gonna be another one that just kind of gets noticed mostly by the core audience and then just sort of goes along. This is actually a pretty important video. What we're seeing, I did a video within the past 10 days or so, 2 weeks, called, well, the thumbnail had "Money's Still Money, No It Is Not." It's a scene from the film Schindler's List where Oscar Schindler is talking to a prospective investor, and the prospective investor happens to be somebody who's being placed in the ghetto, essentially. And the guy says, "Hey, money's still money." And Schindler says, "No, it is not. That's why we're here." And as I brought up in that video, I think we're at a very interesting, call it inflection point in the history of global finance, insofar as, look, we had Bretton Woods at the end of World War II. That system, there's varying degrees of debate amongst reasonable economists and things for how long that lasted. There's a lot of arguments that it never really lasted all that long. It began falling apart immediately. As a practical matter, I think it lasted quite a while because it acted as a framework for people to have a sit down at a table and come up with some kind of working arrangement currency-wise that everybody could live with. That said, a major inflection point in the history of the Bretton Woods system came when Nixon temporarily closed the gold window. They stopped redeeming dollars from gold, and at that point, the dollar effectively, quote-unquote, floated. Now, anybody that knows their history knows actually simultaneously or concomitantly with that, Mr. Henry Kissinger made a deal with Saudi Arabia whereby dollars effectively began becoming linked to oil. And that became known as the petrodollar system, which I would argue was sort of Bretton Woods 2.0. And that has lasted from somewhere in between 71 and 73-ish until roughly now. And now we're seeing the system shifting again. And again, I'm not trying to be Chicken Little up here saying, oh, all things dollar are bad, or one of these guys on YouTube, everything's going to collapse and da-da-da. That's not my point. I don't actually think that's going to happen, especially out here in East Asia. East Asia has productive capacity. They have actually a fairly sophisticated financial system now. We have out here in Southeast Asia a fairly sophisticated financial system now that can weather these storms. And if anything, what may happen is East and Southeast Asia and even South Asia may become sort of insulated, if you will, from the rest of the world. And, where the rest of the world may be having serious economic problems in certain places, this area is unlikely to have that. Because why is that? Well, there's been a multitude of developments over the past 5 years. I've briefly discussed it both on this channel and on my other channel where I did sort of long form stuff, which I'm not doing as much right now. We're kind of reconstituting that. I'm building a new platform for our paid news subscribers as well as for new sort of content, for new services, which I am finishing up. I will unveil that sooner rather than later. That said, if you want to get information or if you want to access the long form content, you can feel free to do so. You can email us media@integrity-legal.com and I can get you information on how to get on the email list for long form content where I talk about all this stuff in even greater depth than I'm talking about right here. Also, while I'm talking my book really quickly, my better half and I set up a restaurant here in downtown Bangkok, Pancake Palace, as the name implies, breakfast anytime, as well as American diner style food, chili bowls, cheeseburgers, hamburgers. We've also got buffalo wings and again, breakfast anytime. So if you're interested, links are in the description below to our location. We'd love to see you. Now, going back on this, the point I'm trying to make with this video is not that the sky is falling, but that the world is changing. And it's changing pretty fundamentally, and we're even starting to see it at the street level in terms of tourists and expats here in Thailand. I thought of making this video after reading a recent article from the Pattaya Mail, that's pattayamail.com. Article is titled, Why Indians, Chinese, and Russians Don't Complain About Strong Baht or Pattaya Prices. This is an interesting article where I urge those who are watching this video, go check it out for yourselves. because it's quite a bit longer. I'm going to quote a couple of excerpts here. But on its face, it would seem like, oh, it's just kind of another article about what's going on in tourist Thailand. When you drill down even just a bit past the surface, you realize that we're talking about pretty substantial observation regarding the state of the currency market, if you will. So, quoting directly, Pattaya, Thailand, as debate swirls online about whether Thailand's baht is quote-unquote too strong for tourists, one curious trend stands out. While many Europeans and long-term Western visitors lament shrinking exchange rates, travelers from India, China, and Russia seem far less concerned or not complaining at all. Quoting further, the question is why? Part of the answer lies in spending patterns and perspective. I don't know if the author knows that what's going, like if that this person is, somewhat versed in international economics, geopolitics, currency, and is kind of trying to steer away from those topics in this article, or if it's just not coming to the forefront of everyone's mind. Not everyone is like a geopolitics nerd, I guess, like I am. So take that for what it's worth. But look, it's more than spending patterns and perspective, and I'll keep quoting. It comes down to fundamental shifts in the economic landscape of Earth. It really is serious stuff. That said, quoting further, for many Indian, Chinese, and Russian tourists, Thailand and Pattaya in particular remains an affordable luxury compared to their domestic leisure options. Even with the baht hovering in the mid-30s to the US dollar or stronger against the euro, hotel rooms, seafood dinners, massages, and nightlife experiences still cost less than equivalent offerings in major cities like Mumbai, Beijing, and Moscow. Interesting, they're trying to steer it back onto the dollar. And frankly, the dollar-baht exchange rate is not too bad right now. It's hovering right around 32. And I've always said, if it stays, if the baht is weaker than 32 to 1, it's good for Thailand in the current economic posture that we're currently in the world, because that's cheap for exports, cheap enough that the exports stay competitive, and it's cheap enough that tourism stays competitive. It's kind of a good little balance, and Thailand gets true value into the country, notwithstanding problems of that value being shaved off in the form of currency, in the form of things like inflation and things. And people forget the U.S. exports inflation effectively, so that's another thing to take into consideration. But again, a constant focus on the dollar is probably not warranted, and I don't think it's a good prism through which to analyze economics anymore, especially out here in East and Southeast Asia or Southern Asia. And as I'll get to here in a moment. Quoting further, the contrast also highlights Thailand's evolving tourism mix. The days when Westerners dominated Pattaya streets are fading fast. Today, Indian wedding parties fill beachfront hotels, Russian families crowd Jomtien, and Chinese tour groups once again pour into Terminal 21 and Central Pattaya. And again, product of the money. At the end of the day, as I've discussed in other videos, I like to use the Halford-Mackinder model when looking at how these things are sort of reorienting. Halford-Mackinder was basically I think he was an academic at the turn of the last century. He came up with the notion of the world island, that what we would call Eurasia, the confluence of Russia, China, the stands, and then in the southern part, India, Southeast Asia, all of this comprises what he calls a world island. And at the periphery, what he called the periphery, we have the maritime powers, effectively. And you have US, UK, the old Anglosphere, what was once called the British Empire, the Commonwealth. And then you've got, to some extent, Western Europe, although I think as time goes on, Europe will sort of kind of end up one way or the other sort of being subsumed into the world island itself. And then you got South America, North America, the Western Hemisphere. That's basically how to look at the so-called periphery. But the world island is effectively, as Halford-Mackinder brought up, where the action is. And this is what we're seeing with the consolidation of BRICS. And look, I don't want to be talking about this. Let me be clear. I'm an American by birth. I naturalized to Thai citizenship. I think that, yeah, I understand the benefits that will come from BRICS, but at the end of the day, and I hate looking at this stuff like zero sum, it does represent a fundamental shift away from the way that things have been, and the way that things have been heretofore, I would say we've come off of largely the so-called unipolar moment, but the Bretton Woods system and things, it constituted a Western-centric paradigm, a Western-centric world order, if you want to use that term. And we're seeing a shift in that. Good, bad, or indifferent. There's pros to it, there's cons to it. I don't know how great it is for Thailand. I hope Thailand maintains her national sovereignty, her autonomy, and just kind of trades with everybody and keeps everybody at arm's length. That would be good in my mind. But these changes are having an impact on the demographics of who's coming to Thailand, because who has the money? Well, it's the people with the productive capacity, the Chinese, the Russians in terms of natural resources, and now the Indians, also similar to the Chinese in terms of manufacturing. These trends look like they're going nowhere. If anything, they're going to become increasingly prevalent. And the reason for the thumbnail, so in the thumbnail is a graph, and it's an interesting graph. I really like it. I've used it before on things like Twitter and stuff when I'm trying to explain the phenomenon that we're seeing. If you look at that graph and you go back to 1820, we'll go ahead and throw this up on screen. You go back to 1820 and you basically look at when what I would call the zenith of colonialism, it sort of hit its parabolic moment where that hockey stick kind of moment happened, and the imperial powers, so-called colonial powers, began having a lot of economic influence on the world, and it was diminishing the powers or the economic effect on the world, if you will, or taking up more space in the economic realm than theretofore had been places like India and China. But if you look, there's a curve, and it's going the other way now. If you look at it, it's sort of like a wave that's ebbing, okay? China, India, Eurasia generally, Southeast Asia, these places are becoming more economically vibrant. And let's be quite honest, especially in places like the US where we hollowed out our, to use the phrase that Ross Perot used when discussing NAFTA, there will be a giant sucking sound, and he was dead right. There was a giant sucking sound in the aftermath of NAFTA of American manufacturing jobs. And look, Trump has that diagnosis correct. There's been a sucking sound of those jobs out of especially the United States, but I would say the greater Anglosphere, if you will, and Western Europe. It was all in favor of these more high-tech jobs and things like that. But now even the tech, as I've discussed in another video where I discussed how I thought that the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank was the sign of a Yuasa shift, where basically the innovative impetus or momentum, if you will, the spark of innovation was moving over to here to East Asia. And I think that that's borne out largely since the time I made that video. But these two events coupled together, where there's no, manufacturing's been sucked out, if you will, of the West, and then at the same time we're starting to see the innovative, call it sciences, arts, whatever, arts and sciences of innovation are moving into East Asia, or the world island, if you will. You're seeing the productive capacity that goes with that, and the disproportionate economic advantages that accrue to that going with that as well. And the citizenry of those countries, namely India, China, Russia, are now having more disposable income. And where are they spending it? Well, down here in old Thailand, where folks like to come for their vacations. This is what's happening here. We're at one of these moments. Money's still money. No, it is not. That's why we're here. I like that scene. It sums up, there's a lot in Schindler's List that sums up critical moments of transition in history. And you can get away from the underlying facts and the underlying storyline of what's going on in that particular story. But there's just observations that sort of transcend any given time period on this stuff. And we're at one of these moments. It's not as negative, it's by a long shot. We're definitely not in as negative a moment. But as I've discussed in other videos, Southeast Asia through ASEAN has started doing tons of trade now in local currencies. Okay? India, Russia, China, I'll throw this up on the screen here. This is an example, or sort of an artist's rendering, if you will, of Mbridge, which is a project between the People's Bank of China, Hong Kong Monetary Authority, Bank of Thailand, and the United Arab Emirates Monetary Authority to create this cross-border platform for international trade, wherein they can use their own currencies, and it's instantaneous. It's really quite, it's my understanding, it's quite efficient. It's just, they can start trading now through these mechanisms. The result of this is the system through which we viewed exchange rates is shifting. It's wildly shifting. It's like shaking up an Etch-a-Sketch, if you will. And everything's just sort of getting set to a new normal. I kind of hate that term, but that's probably apt under the circumstances. And we're now seeing on a street level the consequences of these changes in geopolitics and international economics and in international finance on a practical level at the street level here in both expat and tourist Thailand. That said, quoting further, while some Western voices continue to argue over whether the baht is quote unquote too strong or quote makes no difference unquote, much of Pathia's new visitor base simply isn't complaining because to them, Thailand still feels like a bargain. And that's the thing. I think a lot of the Westerners are operating under the misguided presumption of money's still money. And the result, as Oskar Schindler puts it in that scene, no, it is not. That's why we're here. I'm not saying money doesn't have value. I'm not saying it's not still, a currency is not still a means of exchange. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is in the past, whatever you want to call it, Western currencies had a, this whole too strong or makes no difference. Stop thinking about it in terms of currencies. What you need to be thinking about it in is the productive capacity of the underlying country now, because as these new mechanisms of cross-border trade manifest themselves, it's the actual value that's capable of being created by the country from whence these people come that will more and more dictate the value in terms of exchange rate and the value in terms of what they can get, for example, here in Thailand for their foreign currency more and more. It will no longer be through the prism of primarily the dollar, but Western currencies and Western financial institutions. It's breaking away from that. And these countries are able to come to Thailand now, and when they bring their money, it's not through the same pipeline, if you will, that it once was coming through. And therefore, these folks don't feel like it's such a bad deal. Meanwhile, the countries that traditionally, Western countries that traditionally had disproportionate purchasing power here in Thailand, especially in the aftermath of 1997, which I've had my theories that recently certain, let's call it offshore foreign influencers, if you will, undue offshore foreign influencers, have been trying to place Thailand back into a position in 1997, in my mind, possibly because they want to have the same effect that occurred after 97 for roughly, in earnest, about 10 years, but really, you even felt the aftermath effects of that for 20 years, really. It wasn't until, I think, if you look back, it wasn't until 2017 where Thailand was really able to get past all of that, sort of financially. One, Thailand is inoculated against that. We're very well aware of the machinations that can go down to create another 1997. But understand as well, the plumbing, if you will, of the international financial system as well as the international economy has changed. And so folks that are coming from these countries that are consolidating into a greater, frankly, more vibrant economic system are coming to Thailand, and they're not viewing things as expensive, if you will, as folks who are coming from, for lack of a better term, the old system. These are not things I particularly want to see happening. They just are happening. It's what's coming down the pike, if you will, and it's evidence. We're now seeing it at the street level in terms of tourism. I think, if you talk to expats and things, especially folks who've been around a while, you'll hear similar things being echoed through that community. It isn't a good thing. What does it Taoists say? It's not a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It's just a thing. It is what it is. It's something we're going to be seeing more and more of. So don't be surprised when we see these changes in the future. Now, that being said, we'll certainly be keeping you updated on this channel as the situation evolves.